4 years before the world learned the name Chernobyl, something happened at Reactor 1. A valve stuck closed, a cooling channel overheated, uranium ruptured, and radioactive fragments escaped into the atmosphere. The operators did not notice for hours, the cleanup took months, and the public was told nothing. This is the story of the disaster before the disaster, the warning that went unheeded, the accident that was buried beneath lies and silence until it was too late. Close your eyes. Let us travel back to September 9th, 1982, to a day when Chernobyl could have learned its lesson, to a day when history could have been different. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant in September 1982 was not yet infamous. It was simply one of many nuclear facilities across the Soviet Union. Modern, productive, a symbol of technological achievement. The first reactor had come online in 1977. By 1982, 2 reactors were operating, generating electricity for millions of people. A third and fourth were under construction. The complex was growing. The future looked bright. The plant used RBMK reactors, a Soviet design, large, powerful, different from the pressurized water reactors used in the West. The RBMK had individual pressure tubes for each fuel channel, thousands of them running through a massive graphite core. It was an unusual design, complex, but the Soviets believed in it. They built many such reactors across the country. They trusted the technology. But the RBMK design had flaws, flaws that were not widely known, not widely discussed. In certain conditions, at low power, the reactor could become unstable. The control systems were not fast enough to respond to rapid changes, and there was no containment structure, no massive concrete dome to hold radiation if something went catastrophically wrong. These flaws would become famous in 1986, but in 1982 they were secrets, technical details buried in classified documents, known to some engineers, ignored by others, never discussed publicly. On September 9th, 1982, Reactor 1 was scheduled for routine maintenance, a standard procedure. The reactor would be taken offline. Maintenance crews would perform inspections and repairs. Then the reactor would be restarted. It was a routine operation, nothing unusual, nothing that should have gone wrong. The maintenance included work on the cooling system, valves and pumps that circulated water through the reactor core to remove heat. These systems were critical. Without cooling, the uranium fuel would overheat. But the work was routine. The procedures were established. The operators were experienced. The maintenance was completed. The reactor was prepared for restart. The control rods were withdrawn. The nuclear reaction began. Power started to rise. Everything seemed normal. But one valve had not been reopened. A cooling valve for channel 13-44. It remained closed following the maintenance. Perhaps someone forgot to open it. Perhaps a checklist was not followed correctly. Perhaps communication failed between the maintenance crew and the operators. The exact cause was never made fully clear. But the result was certain. Channel 13-44 had no cooling water flowing through it. The uranium fuel pellets in that channel began to heat up. Without water to carry the heat away, the temperature climbed rapidly. The zirconium cladding that encased the fuel began to soften, then to melt. The uranium itself reached temperatures where it became structurally unstable. And then the channel ruptured. It was not an explosion, not like what would happen 4 years later, but it was a failure, a breach. Radioactive material from inside the fuel channel escaped into the reactor building. Uranium oxide fragments, gaseous fission products, isotopes that should have remained contained within the sealed fuel assembly. The reactor continued to operate. The operators in the control room did not immediately realize what had happened. Their instruments showed normal readings for most of the reactor. One channel out of thousands had failed, but the overall power output remained stable. The reactor kept generating electricity. Hours passed. The shift changed. New operators took over. The reactor hummed along, and all the while radioactive material was escaping through the ventilation system, up the stack, into the atmosphere, invisible, odorless, spreading on the wind. It was not until several hours after the rupture that someone noticed something was wrong. Radiation alarms in the plant began to sound, not the immediate, urgent alarms that would indicate a major accident, but persistent warnings that radiation levels were elevated. Contamination was being detected in areas where it should not be. The operators began investigating. They checked systems. They reviewed data. And slowly they pieced together what had happened. Channel 13-44 had failed. The fuel had overheated. The cladding had ruptured. And now radioactive material was loose in the reactor building. The reactor was shut down. Emergency procedures were initiated. Teams were dispatched to assess the damage and begin containment efforts. The extent of the problem became clear. This was not a minor incident. This was a partial core meltdown, limited to one channel, yes, but still a serious failure. The cleanup began immediately. Workers entered the contaminated areas wearing protective equipment. They surveyed radiation levels. They collected samples. They worked to contain the spread of radioactive material. The work was dangerous. Radiation exposures were significant, but the work had to be done. In Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, the residents knew nothing. There were no announcements, no warnings, no evacuations. People went about their daily lives. Children went to school. Adults went to work. Some of them worked at the plant and participated in the cleanup. But they were told to keep quiet. They were told it was a minor incident. They were told not to alarm anyone. The official Soviet policy on nuclear accidents was strict. Secrecy above all. The public did not need to know. The international community did not need to know. Information was compartmentalized. Only those who absolutely needed to know were informed, and even they were told only as much as was deemed necessary. So the 1982 accident at Reactor 1 was classified. The details were restricted. The reports were filed and locked away, and the cleanup continued in silence. For 8 months, Reactor 1 remained offline. The damaged fuel channel had to be replaced. The contaminated areas had to be decontaminated. The reactor systems had to be inspected and tested. The work was extensive, complicated, expensive. When the reactor was finally restarted, its power output was reduced by 20%. The damage had been too extensive to fully restore the original capacity. Reactor 1 would operate at 800 megawatts instead of 1,000, a permanent reminder of what had gone wrong. But outside the plant, beyond the small circle of those directly involved, no one knew. The accident was not reported in the Soviet press. It was not disclosed to international nuclear safety organizations. It was not shared with other reactor operators who might have learned from it. It was simply hidden, buried, forgotten. Until years later, until after 1986, until after the catastrophe that made Chernobyl a household name. Only then did information about the 1982 accident begin to emerge. Documents were declassified. Workers shared their stories. Researchers pieced together what had happened. And when they did, they saw the pattern. They saw the warning signs that had been ignored. They saw the culture of secrecy and negligence that had allowed a preventable accident to occur and then to be covered up. The 1982 accident was similar to an incident that had occurred at the Leningrad nuclear power plant in 1975. At Leningrad, a cooling channel had also ruptured, also releasing radioactive material. That accident had been studied. Lessons had been learned. Recommendations had been made. But those lessons were not implemented at Chernobyl. The recommendations were not followed. Perhaps information was not properly shared. Perhaps the bureaucracy failed. Perhaps the emphasis on production and meeting targets took priority over safety improvements. Whatever the reason, The failure of Channel 13-44 in 1982 should have been a wake-up call. It should have prompted a thorough review of reactor safety. It should have led to improved procedures for maintenance and restart operations. It should have highlighted the weaknesses in the RBMK design. Instead, it was hidden, and the plant continued to operate. And 4 years later, Reactor 4 would suffer a catastrophe that the 1982 accident foreshadowed in miniature. The negligence that allowed the 1982 accident was the same negligence that would cause the 1986 disaster. Operators not following procedures, safety systems being overridden or ignored, a culture that prioritized production over caution, management that did not take safety seriously enough. And underlying it all, the Soviet system's obsession with secrecy, the refusal to acknowledge problems, the suppression of information that might damage the reputation of nuclear power or the Soviet Union itself, the belief that admitting a mistake was worse than hiding it. This culture of secrecy extended beyond nuclear power. It permeated Soviet society. From industrial accidents to public health crises, information was controlled, minimized, denied. The government decided what the people needed to know, and what the people needed to know, the government believed, was very little. After the 1986 disaster, when the truth about Chernobyl could no longer be hidden, journalists and researchers began investigating the plant's history. They discovered the 1982 accident. They interviewed workers who had been involved in the cleanup. They reviewed documents that had been classified. And they asked the obvious question: what if the 1982 accident had been made public? What if it had been properly investigated? What if the lessons had been learned and applied? Could the 1986 disaster have been prevented? It is impossible to know with certainty. The accidents were different. The 1982 incident was a cooling failure during startup. The 1986 disaster was a power surge during a poorly designed safety test. Different mechanisms, different circumstances. But both accidents revealed the same fundamental problems: design flaws in the RBMK reactor, inadequate safety culture, operators who were not properly trained or supervised, management that did not take safety seriously enough, a system that valued production over prudence. If the 1982 accident had been openly acknowledged, if it had prompted serious reforms, perhaps the culture would have changed. Perhaps safety procedures would have been improved. Perhaps the test that was conducted on April 26, 1986, would have been better planned, better executed, or not conducted at all. But these are hypotheticals. What is certain is that the opportunity was missed. The warning was ignored. And the price was paid 4 years later in lives and land, and a disaster that would reshape history. The workers who cleaned up the 1982 accident received radiation doses, not as high as the liquidators would receive in 1986, but significant nonetheless. Some developed health problems years later. Some died from cancers that might have been caused by their exposures, but their stories were never told. Their sacrifices were never acknowledged. They were the forgotten victims of the forgotten accident. Pripyat continued to grow after 1982. More apartment buildings were constructed. More families moved to the city. The population increased. The schools filled with children. Life was good, modern, prosperous. The nuclear plant was a source of pride and employment. No one in Pripyat knew that Reactor 1 had partially melted down. No one knew that radioactive material had escaped. No one knew that the plant they worked at, the plant that powered their city, had already failed once. When the 1986 disaster occurred, when Pripyat was evacuated, when the extent of the catastrophe became clear, some workers remembered 1982. They remembered the cleanup, the secrecy, the lies, and they realized that the pattern had been there all along. The negligence, the cover-up, the refusal to learn from mistakes. Today, when historians study Chernobyl, the 1982 accident is a footnote, A minor incident overshadowed by the major disaster that followed, but it is an important footnote, a reminder that accidents do not happen in isolation. They happen in contexts, in cultures, in systems that allow problems to persist and warnings to be ignored. The 1982 accident was not inevitable. It was the result of human error compounded by system failure, a valve left closed, a procedure not followed, a mistake that could have been caught but was not. And when it happened, instead of learning from it, the system chose secrecy. Instead of investigating and improving, the system chose to hide and forget. And that choice, that decision to prioritize appearance over reality, to value propaganda over safety, that decision helped set the stage for a disaster that would echo through the decades. Tonight, we remember the accident that was forgotten, the disaster that was hidden, the warning that went unheeded. We remember not to assign blame but to understand, to see how small mistakes compound into catastrophes when the culture allows it, when safety takes a backseat to other priorities, when secrecy is valued over transparency. The 1982 Chernobyl leak was a disaster before the disaster, a precursor, a foreshadowing, and its greatest tragedy was not what happened but what did not happen afterward, the lessons not learned, the changes not made, the truth not told. Let us rest now, here in the knowledge that history offers warnings to those who will listen, and that the cost of ignoring those warnings can be measured in years and lives and contaminated land that will outlast us all.